It is always in South Africa a week that is filled with news, and Mahlatse Mahlase, Editor-in-Chief of EWN, she joins me now to unpack and perhaps look ahead at what possibly could come up in the week that we are going into. And she joins me now. Mahlatse, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you very much for making time to speak to us here. Firstly, I want to pick up on the media advisory that's just come out of the presidency, and that's the president is going to address the nation tonight at 8, and it's got to do with the update on the fight against COVID-19. Any clues about where the president might go? There already is some criticism, though, from some quarters to say, why is the president calling the Johnson & Johnson vaccination program a vaccine rollout, when in actual fact this is in essence a trial by the pharmaceutical company Johnson & Johnson?
Good evening, Xoli. I think that is fair criticism, and we as the media especially have had to be quite specific in the language that we use so that we are not caught in the government communication language that they are using. And we've been quite clear to say that it is an implementation study. Johnson & Johnson is not yet registered in South Africa, so it is not commercially available. They need to go through this process as part of making sure that it passes all of the clinical tests, and then it can be registered. It does look like it's on its way to be registered, given what happened in America this week with the FDA. So perhaps that could be part of what the president will be announcing, because we know that SAPRA has been looking into the matter. But I think also I'm looking to the president to give details on the proper rollout of vaccine. I mean, we had the Minister of Health earlier this week making such ambitious targets around saying that they need at least about 1 million people to be vaccinated by the end of March. That is just a few weeks, and March is starting tomorrow. So we need to know in terms of what they have acquired. We know that they have told us in the past that there's about 20 million doses of Pfizer that has been acquired, and we know that there's another batch from Johnson & Johnson that arrived over the weekend. So we would need to know what then is the next step. I'm hoping that besides Johnson & Johnson program, we are getting the Pfizer vaccines, and we then will be able to roll out and start going beyond the health workers, because beyond the health workers, we need South Africans to also start being jabbed. We have an ambitious target of 40 million people that need to be inoculated by the end of the year. But I also think that there are those that might be looking for eased regulations, whether it will go down to level 1. I'm not so convinced, but I know that there's certain sectors that are hoping that there will be eased regulations and even the curfew to be removed, just so that there's ease of doing business and they can get back to work. Yeah,
and just touching on that issue of whether the country will move perhaps a notch down from level 3, I wonder whether that indeed might be the case, because the president, when he spoke to SANEF on Friday, it didn't sound as though he is swayed by that, particularly the Easter period approaching, Mahlatse. That could potentially be a matter, or the events that get held during this time, they could potentially be super spreader events.
And I think we should never forget that we do still have the threat of a third wave, and we know that there's been a lot of pressure, especially from the churches, especially the big churches where, you know, gatherings of 50 or even hundreds just doesn't suit them. We know that some churches at any given time take about 2,000 people within their venues, and there has been pressure on the president to ease that, but we know that churches are potential super spreaders, and we shouldn't actually let our guards down. But in reality, Xoli, at some point, I think as South Africans also, we then need to also take personal responsibility, because you know, we cannot continue to depend on government to enforce rules to ensure that we contain the spread of the pandemic. I think we're seeing the damage to the economy. You look at those unemployment numbers, and many people are saying that the worst is still yet to come. At some point, we need to return the country to full operation in terms of the economy so that we can regain some of those jobs and people can have a chance at earning a living. And I think, and unfortunately, there's still a lot of South Africans who are irresponsible and are still not following the basic protocols that are there to safeguard their lives. And I think we have to worry around that second wave. The hope would have been that, by the time we reach June, as it's been predicted, that we might be seeing it, we might have a large portion of the population inoculated, but we don't know if that will happen by now. I think I'm not anticipating that he will take us all the way to level 1, maybe some easing of level 3. We've seen different versions of level 3 and different things being eased within that lockdown level 3. But I think the most important thing is for us as South Africans to continue to be cautious.
Yeah. Mahlatse, I want us to look now at the front page of the City Press newspaper. Their main headline there, Special Investigating Unit probes 2 billion rand Eskom fraud. And the sub-headline, crooks allegedly funneled large sums of money from the utility using fraudulent transactions, possibly with inside help. I mean, this kind of headline around Eskom at a time when that utility is saddled with so many problems, surely this is not what Andre de Ruyter wants to be dealing with at a time like this.
I don't think that's what all of us as South Africans want to hear, because we are bearing the brunt of corruption at Eskom. We know that we are likely to see an increase in terms of what we spend on electricity, and all of us feel it in our pockets, right? And when we see stories like this, where 2 billion potentially, that has been stolen from Eskom, really just does not build confidence in the utility. I think de Ruyter, the CEO, Andre de Ruyter, has been trying quite hard to rebuild confidence in the state-owned entity. But I think this shows just the deep levels of corruption within Eskom. I mean, when you hear the story, it's basically somebody creating many different companies and basically invoicing for work that is not done at all. And that surely cannot happen without inside help. And this would be somebody who's very familiar with the people at Eskom and how the systems work, and perhaps also just shows the weaknesses of the systems within Eskom. Yes, it might be a bit unfair to blame it all on de Ruyter, because this seems to have been going on for 3 years before he also came in. But we are looking to him to finally clean up at Eskom. And I know that companies in this country cannot afford the escalating costs of electricity. We as individuals can't afford the escalating cost of individuals on our electricity. And we are looking for Eskom at least to do the right thing, because we are all feeling it. And I'm hoping that, when we hear of these kind of things, we hear proper investigations being followed up and actually people being arrested and put in jail.
And yeah, look, at the end of the day, the buck stops with Andre de Ruyter. So at some point, he's going to have to put his foot down. Looking at page 4, Mahlatse, of the City Press newspaper, a story that we've just touched on. And, of course, it's an update that the president is going to give to the nation. Now the ANC wants political gatherings unbanned. If the president is going to tell us about strict rules that ought to be followed, surely this headline has got to be troublesome to him. He can't be party to such.
I think the pressure has been piling up on the president. All indications are that we won't see a postponement of the elections, the municipal elections this year. So a lot of parties, especially we saw from the EFF, they want to start doing the work. Local government elections are difficult, and it will probably be a lot harder for political parties to engage with potential voters, and many of them would like to start the ball rolling. But I also think inside the ANC, it's influenced by many other things. COVID-19 has put a serious halt on political mechanizations within the ANC. You can look at, for example, a region like eThekwini in KwaZulu-Natal, where it's also due to go to Congress, and the political battle there is intensifying, and that is being replicated across many regions, where a lot of people, especially with the divisions that are deepening in the ANC, they are hoping that they can actually have a National General Council. And for that to happen, they would need to have the branch meetings, they would need to have branch elections, and some provinces also need to go to elections. And some of them are feeling the brunt of not being able to engage with the electorate. So I think the pressure is piling on. But I think for me also what it demonstrates is for parties to lack the ability to use technology to continue with political engagement. I think it's important for all political parties to continue to engage with their members, with their branches, and also with potential voters. But it can't be, I think, the way we are used to it, where there is political rallies and mass gathering of people, especially when we are a country facing a pandemic.
Yeah.
I think political parties need to be a lot more creative in terms of how do they engage with the electorate as they get ready for the municipal elections. I think, though, the pressure is piling on the president. And if he does allow for political gatherings, then churches will also be able to say, look, we also need bigger crowds to also gather. And then there will be nightclubs who also come and say, but why can't we also continue to operate? So it's going to be, if he does go ahead and grant it, it will mean that he needs to also open up other sectors of the economy.
Indeed, and I can just see the politics all over this. You mentioned the National General Council of the ANC. I can just see some within that party saying, let's go to the NGC. It's time to unban political gatherings. Let's look at then, if we are going to touch on politics, Mahlatse. This is Bongani Bongo, the ANC MP, who was in studio here, by the way, a little earlier. He says here, at the headline, Bongo says ANC should use his court victory as an example. And that comes after the acquittal by the Western Cape High Court. And upon claims, though, further claims by Bongani Bongo, Mahlatse, that Stellenbosch, some who sit in Stellenbosch, basically plot the downfall of some people within the ANC, including him. Where do you begin to look at this story and versus what Bongani Bongo speaks about in this interview we've just had with him?
I think his acquittal this week does give those that have been calling for the step-aside resolution to be thrown out some arsenal, because this is going to be used as an example to say, look at what happens. I would have stepped aside, but then I was then acquitted, and we keep saying that we must be careful of finding people guilty before they're actually found guilty by the courts. But I think in essence, this is just the ANC and its internal battle that is going to intensify and not get any better this year. We are going to see it, I think, come full circle. I think in the next coming weeks, what happens with former President Jacob Zuma, if the Constitutional Court goes ahead and accepts the Deputy Chief Justice's recommendation that he be imprisoned, we are likely to see a rallying around him by those that are aggrieved with President Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership and feeling out in the cold and possibly finding themselves facing some legal prosecution or the other. And they will continue to use this case as an example. I heard him in that interview repeating what many of them that are supporting the Secretary General have been saying, that the charges against the Secretary General just do not make sense. They've said that he's basically accused of lack of oversight in the Free State. So I think that we're going to see a deepening battle for the ANC, within the ANC, and I think that's partly why some within the ANC want political gatherings to continue, because the battle might be lost by Ace Magashule and his group inside the National Executive Committee, but he's quite clear that he can win it if he manages to get access to the branches. Yeah. And we had seen him when he was able to go to various provinces where he had started engaging with many branches. There are a lot of conversations that we understand are happening at branch level with certain regions within the ANC's different provinces, some factions within Northwest, also KwaZulu-Natal, and also in Mpumalanga. And we might be seeing that coalition of the wounded, so to speak, coming stronger and stronger, especially if political gatherings are going to be allowed, because they need to find a way to express that they still have power and control and influence within the ANC, even though they've lost within the National Executive Committee.
Still in conversation with the editor-in-chief of Eyewitness News, Mahlatse Mahlase. And Mahlatse, just as a last paper to look at, the Sunday Times front page, quote-unquote, "I'd work with Cyril, not DD," close quotes. That's John Steenhuisen, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, and needless to say that this has sparked a war of words, if you like, with him and his predecessor, Mmusi Maimane.
I saw that outrage from Mmusi Maimane, of course, taking umbrage to him being mentioned and the failed political campaign of the previous elections. I think there's a few things here in John Steenhuisen's comments. One, trying to influence what happens inside the ANC. And in a way, we know that the conversations around who takes over or whether Cyril Ramaphosa has a second term has already started in the ANC. And in large part, it's that conversation we were having there around, whether we see a National General Council beginning to weaken President Cyril Ramaphosa within the ANC, and who actually emerges as his successor if he doesn't go ahead with a second term. I think that I've seen a lot of people within the ANC quite angry with John Steenhuisen's suggestion. And actually, those that have been fighting President Cyril Ramaphosa saying this just shows that that notion that he is quite close to white monopoly capital, or Stellenbosch, as the coded word that was used by Bongo there, saying that this just proves how close he is to the DA. You can remember also for the DA to say that they would be willing to go into a coalition with the ANC is quite huge. The DA has styled itself as a party in opposition of the ANC. And it was quite clear, especially during Helen Zille's tenure, when the ANC was being led by then President Jacob Zuma, that would not be something that they would actually consider. And I think it speaks, of course, of the DA not confident enough that they could have an outright majority and unseat the ANC. But there's also a realization that given the trend that we have seen, the ANC could be weakening, and we might see ourselves at national government with the situation that we have seen at local government with no outright majority and a need for coalitions. I think for a lot of South Africans, we panic when we hear the word coalitions, given how disastrous they have been at the local government. But I also was surprised that he's not talking around coalitions now, given that we have local government elections coming. And I know that there's few people in the ANC who are not quite confident that the party will be able to win the metros, especially following what happened in 2016 when they lost Tshwane, Johannesburg, and Nelson Mandela Bay. And there are those within the ANC that are beginning to speak to the EFF and are hoping that they would be able to swing them to come to the party and be able to form coalition governments. But I think it just tells us that we are heading for a different time in terms of South African politics.
Yeah. Mahlatse, as a last speaking point, we as media, it's almost an unwritten rule that as a journalist, you are not to be a story. But this week, unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. And that's the incident involving ENCA reporter Lindsay Dentlinger. And before we talk about it, let's just listen to Sbungalwa, that's the chair of the South African National Editors Forum, and what he had to say around this matter.
This country has a dark and a painful history of racial prejudice and violence. And it is not for anyone to tell those who feel racially maligned that they are being malicious. This is a moment that calls for cool heads and for reflection. And as journalists, we are people. We all have our unconscious biases. Therefore, it is important that we take the time to reflect on our actions and also how we relate to our guests and audiences. Where we have made mistakes, we should admit our mistakes. We should not be defensive and cast those who criticize us as being malicious. Journalists are not above criticism. That is why I feel that the statement released by ENCA last night is quite unfortunate, and it lacked the maturity that this moment demands.
On those exact last words, Mahlatse, by Sibungalwa around the response by ENCA. On the one hand, you had Lindsay Dentlinger and through social media contacting the different MPs that perhaps she felt she may have wronged, and Mkhuleko Hlengwa, the reason I say through social media is that Mkhuleko Hlengwa shared this information via social media to say he received a call from Lindsay, who essentially was extending an apology to him, and that a meeting is going to ensue between the two of them. Then, on the other hand, you have ENCA basically insinuating that its reporter had done no wrong. What's your view of the stance that ENCA has taken here?
I agree there with Sibungalwa as he was speaking as chairperson of SANEF, the organization that I'm also a member of. And it's important that as media houses, we always realize we exist for the audiences that we serve. And whatever, even when we don't think that was the intention, how it is being received is what we must be able to respond to. And we must be able to respond to criticism and accept it and commit to doing better. And I think ENCA failed in that regard to actually say, it's not, for me, it was not only just a Lindsay matter, but it's a systems, it's the entire production line, because Xoli, you know, once you're standing in front of the camera, there's so many other people that are involved in that production. If the policy of the business is to say that everybody must be wearing a mask, why is it that no action was taken when there was 1, 2, or 3 people that were not wearing a mask, if that is actually a company policy? It speaks to a failure within to actually enforce the rules that you have implied. And you need to be seen to be consistent. The rules need to be applied equally to everybody. And we know the history of this country, and we need to always remember that we don't live outside of the realities that is South Africa. Racism is a reality in South Africa, and it's our job actually as the media to foster cohesion and to ensure that we build and we ensure that as South Africans we are able to come together. And the response that they gave was not of an institution that was willing to listen and actually correct where it had actually gone wrong. And I think that apart from Lindsay as the reporter who was there, there was a moment for the whole company to say, let's all sit and reflect. How did this happen? Did our systems fail? What have we failed to do when this incident happened over several days and this policy was not applied equally? And I think, unfortunately, it's not just when one media house gets it wrong. It's not about them. It impacts on all of us. We saw it whether it was in the last week with Jacques Paul and the lying that we saw in the Daily Maverick. It impacts on all of us because we're such a powerful institution. We can influence where society goes, and we can actually, when we are finding ourselves on the wrong side of where South Africa needs to be going, we need to accept and concede and apologize and actually commit to South Africans that we will do better.
Yeah. Mahlatse, I'm going to lump 2 questions in one, and that is that, firstly, in your view, as someone who has chaired SANEF, you have experience more than I have in the media field. Should ENCA, upon reflection, retract the statement that they have issued? And then on the other, I read an opinion piece by the former DA leader in Parliament, Lindiwe Mazibuko, who takes issue with the notion of unconscious bias. And she says we actually are not paying regard to what has happened to people who were at the receiving end of this unconscious bias. And for her, that simply just doesn't wash. Your views on these 2 questions or 2 elements?
I haven't read Lindiwe's column, but I think on the first part, if ENCA were to retract, but also to commit to doing better, it would go a long way in rebuilding the relationship with its audiences, and actually to see itself as part of South African society. Newsrooms, by their very nature, are not outside of what happens in South Africa. We are all products of the country that we are born in. We can't expect that if we are living in a country where race and racism is a problem, that won't manifest itself inside newsrooms. We see that all the time, and that's part of why SANEF, when it was formed, part of its pillars was actually transformation within newsrooms, because our very newsrooms were also places where black people were discriminated against, where black women could not lead, where black people were reported in certain ways in some of the newsrooms because of those who were in power and in control. And we are also in a process of transformation, and that's why it's important where we air, and the audience and the listeners and the viewers are showing this to us. We need to be listening and saying, what can we do to actually do better? And unconscious bias is a real thing. We are all products of this deeply troubled past, and unfortunately racism continues in democratic South Africa, and we need to do a lot of unlearning as a people, as South Africans, and how we relate to each other. And that's actually quite an important thing. And for me, the biggest thing around this, what happened this week, was the failure to realize the impact on those that were wronged, and not hearing their pain and hearing how this actually affected them. Whether your intentions, whatever your intentions were, how it was received was actually to wrong those people. And that's when we need to take a moment and actually say, we apologize.
Mahlatse Mahlase, thank you very much for your time. She is Editor-in-Chief at Eyewitness News. Well.